Have you ever imagined what would happen if power and money allowed you to judge someone without evidence? And what if years later that person came back to confront you with the weight of your own decisions? This is the story of a young housemaid unjustly accused of a crime she didn't commit. Cast out into a brutal snowstorm with no belongings and no right to defend herself, she swore she would return one day. What the powerful Duke never expected was that her return would change not only their lives, but the fate of all New York society. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how Catherine Morgan turned her tears into power, her injustice into justice, and her suffering into a revolution that shook the foundations of 19th century high society. How she rose from humiliated servant to one of the most influential women in New York. And most of all, how her final confrontation with the man who condemned her shocked everyone in a way no one could have imagined. If you love stories of resilience, revenge, and redemption, filled with unexpected twists and an ending that will stay with you for days, this video was made for you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more incredible stories like this one. Hit the like button so others can discover this fascinating tale, and share it with that friend who loves a good drama and mystery. And don't forget to save this video, because you'll want to watch it more than once to catch every detail of this extraordinary story. Get ready, because what you're about to uncover will completely change the way you see justice, revenge, and the power of true forgiveness. The morning sun had barely crept over the Manhattan skyline when Catherine Morgan hurried through the servants' entrance of the Winchester mansion. At 19, she carried herself with a grace that seemed to transcend her position as a lady's maid. Her auburn hair neatly pinned beneath a pristine white cap, her uniform pressed to perfection. The year was 1889. And life in the most prestigious household on Fifth Avenue was about to change in ways no one could foresee. Catherine's footsteps echoed through the servants' corridor, a narrow passageway hidden from the grandeur of the main halls. After 2 years of service, she had memorized every creak in the floorboards, every shadowy corner where dust might gather. As she approached the kitchen, the familiar sounds of pre-dawn activity reached her ears. The clatter of pots, the whispered instructions from Mrs. Hawthorne, the head cook, and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables for the day's meals. "You're late, Catherine," Sarah Sullivan called out, her Irish accent thick with amusement rather than reproach. Sarah, 2 years Catherine's senior, was bustling around with a tray of delicate china. The Duchess has already rung twice for her morning tea. Catherine smiled at her friend, straightening her apron. "Mrs. Edgerton held me up. Another lecture about proper silver polishing technique." She rolled her eyes, mimicking the stern housekeeper's voice. "In my day, young lady, we could see our reflections in every piece." The two girls shared a quiet laugh, but it was cut short by the sound of the service bell, 3 sharp rings from the Duchess's quarters. Catherine's expression immediately shifted to one of focused attention. "I should go," she said, reaching for the silver tea service that Sarah had prepared. "Wish me luck. You know how she's been since—" She left the sentence unfinished, but Sarah understood. The entire household had been walking on eggshells since the unexpected death of the old Duke 3 months prior. Duke Henry Winchester had been a pillar of New York society. His sudden passing from a heart attack, leaving not just a grieving widow, but a legacy that his young son William seemed ill-prepared to handle. Balancing the tea tray with practiced ease, Catherine made her way through the concealed staircase that led to the family quarters. Unlike most servants, she had the rare privilege of using the main corridors during certain hours, a testament to the trust Duchess Margaret placed in her. As she walked, the contrast between the two worlds within the mansion struck her anew. The servants' domain with its functional simplicity, and the family's realm of marble floors, silk wallpapers, and priceless art. The hallway leading to the Duchess's suite was lined with portraits of Winchester ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow Catherine's every move. She had once found them intimidating, these stern-faced men and women who had built an empire on steel and railways. Now they were as familiar as the morning routine itself. A soft knock on the ornate door announced her arrival. "Enter," came the refined voice of Duchess Margaret. Catherine stepped into the suite, immediately enveloped by the scent of lavender and rosewater. The room was a sanctuary of pale blues and silvers, with heavy velvet drapes still drawn against the morning light. Duchess Margaret sat at her vanity, her greying hair loosely braided, her face bearing the marks of recent tears. "Your tea, Your Grace," Catherine said softly, setting the tray on the nearby table. The Duchess turned, offering a wan smile. At 52, Margaret Winchester remained a handsome woman, though grief had added new lines to her features. "Thank you, dear. Come, help me with my hair while we talk." This too had become part of their routine. In the month since her husband's death, the Duchess had grown increasingly reliant on Catherine's presence, sharing confidences that crossed the usual boundaries between mistress and maid. As Catherine began the familiar ritual of brushing out the older woman's hair, she listened to the daily concerns that would never reach the ears of New York's social elite. "William is struggling," the Duchess confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's not ready for all this responsibility. And now Victoria—" She paused, her lips tightening with disapproval. Catherine's hands stilled for a moment. Victoria Astor, the Duchess's niece by marriage, had become a constant presence in the mansion since the old Duke's death. Beautiful, clever, and utterly ruthless, Victoria seemed to have appointed herself as William's advisor in all matters, personal and financial. "Has Miss Astor arrived already this morning?" Catherine asked carefully, resuming her gentle strokes with the silver-backed brush. "She practically lives here now," the Duchess replied with a hint of bitterness. Always whispering in William's ear, filling his head with grand schemes and social ambitions, my Henry would never have tolerated such interference. The mention of the late Duke brought fresh tears to the Duchess's eyes. Catherine quickly offered a handkerchief, her heart aching for the woman who had shown her nothing but kindness since her arrival at the mansion. A sudden commotion from downstairs interrupted their quiet moment. Raised voices filtered through the floor, unusual in a household that prided itself on discretion and decorum. "What on earth?" the Duchess murmured, rising from her vanity. Catherine moved to the window, pulling back the heavy drapes just enough to peer down at the front entrance. A sleek carriage bearing the Astor crest stood at the curb, and Victoria herself was ascending the front steps, a vision in emerald green silk, despite the early hour. Behind her, William Winchester followed, his tall frame slightly stooped, as if already burdened by the weight of his new title. "It's Miss Victoria and the Duke, Your Grace," Catherine reported. "They seem to be arguing?" Indeed, even from this distance, the tension between the cousins was palpable. Victoria gesticulated wildly with her gloved hands, while William shook his head, his expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. The Duchess joined Catherine at the window, her face hardening as she observed the scene below. "That woman will be the ruin of this family," she muttered. Then louder, "Catherine, go find out what this is about. Discreetly, mind you." "Yes, Your Grace." Catherine curtsied and slipped out of the room. Her curiosity piqued. She made her way to the servants' staircase, positioning herself where she could overhear without being seen. Victoria's voice carried through the marble foyer, sharp and demanding. "You cannot possibly consider selling the summer estate. Do you have any idea what people will say?" "What people will say?" William's response was weary. "Victoria, the estate is hemorrhaging money. Father left debts, which is precisely why you need to maintain appearances. Wealth attracts wealth, cousin. Show any sign of weakness and the vultures will circle." Catherine pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. The Winchester financial troubles were news to the staff, though it explained the recent dismissal of several junior servants. "I'm trying to be practical," William insisted. "We need to modernize, invest in new industries." "Practical?" Victoria's laugh was brittle. "You sound like one of those nouveau riche industrialists. We are Winchesters, William. Our name alone is worth more than any investment." Their voices faded as they moved deeper into the house, but Catherine had heard enough. She hurried back to the Duchess's suite, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd overheard. "Well?" the Duchess asked anxiously as Catherine re-entered. "Financial discussions, Your Grace," Catherine replied carefully. "Miss Victoria seems concerned about maintaining appearances." The Duchess's expression darkened. "Of course she is. That girl cares for nothing but status and power." She turned back to her vanity, suddenly looking older than her years. "Catherine, my dear, I fear dark days are coming to this house. Promise me you'll stay vigilant. There are few people I trust anymore." "I promise, Your Grace," Catherine said solemnly, though a chill ran down her spine at the Duchess's words. As she resumed her duties that morning, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that the Duchess's fears were well-founded. The mansion, once a symbol of stability and prosperity, now felt like a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Staff whispered in corners about delayed wages and Victoria's increasing influence over the young Duke. Even the more experienced servants seemed on edge, as if sensing the approaching storm. During the midday meal in the servants' hall, Catherine shared what she could with Sarah without betraying the Duchess's confidence. "Something's not right," Sarah agreed, pushing her soup around her bowl. "Mrs. Edgerton's been doing the accounts herself, won't let anyone see the books. And have you noticed how many deliveries have been cancelled?" Catherine nodded. "The Duchess mentioned there might be changes coming." "Changes?" Sarah scoffed. "That's what they call it when they're about to sack half of us." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. Martha from the scullery heard Miss Victoria talking about streamlining the household. We all know what that means. The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Mr. Blackwood, the butler, his face grave. "Miss Morgan, you're wanted in the library. The Duke wishes to speak with you." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. Being summoned by the Duke himself was unprecedented. She smoothed her apron and followed Mr. Blackwood through the mansion, her mind racing with possibilities. The library was William's sanctuary, a room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather. William stood by the window, his back to the door, shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored jacket. "You wanted to see me, Your Grace," Catherine said, dropping into a curtsy. William turned, and Catherine was struck by how much he'd aged in the 3 months since his father's death. Though only 26, new lines creased his forehead, and his blue eyes held a weariness that hadn't been there before. "Ah, Miss Morgan, please come in." His voice was kind, lacking the imperious tone she'd expected. "I understand you've been of great comfort to my mother during this difficult time." "I do my best, Your Grace." He studied her for a moment, as if seeing her properly for the first time. "You're educated, aren't you? I've noticed you reading in the servants' hall." Catherine felt her cheeks warm. "My father was a school teacher, Your Grace. He believed in education for everyone." "Admirable." William moved to his desk, shuffling some papers. "I wonder if I might ask something of you. My mother, she's not handling the changes well. The household needs to adapt to new circumstances, but I fear she'll resist if the suggestions come from me or..." He glanced toward the door, as if expecting Victoria to materialize. "From others who might not have her best interests at heart." Catherine's pulse quickened. Was the Duke asking her to spy on his own mother? "I'm not sure I understand, Your Grace." I need someone I can trust to help ease my mother into accepting certain necessary economies, someone she already confides in." He met her eyes directly. "I would consider it a personal favor, Miss Morgan, and I always reward loyalty." The weight of his request settled over Catherine like a heavy cloak. To accept would mean betraying the Duchess's trust. To refuse might cost her position in the household. As she struggled to form a response, a knock at the door interrupted them. Victoria Astor swept in without waiting for permission, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "William, darling, what are you doing closeted away with the help?" Her tone was light, but Catherine detected the steel beneath. "Just household matters, Victoria," William replied, his earlier warmth evaporating. "Miss Morgan, that will be all. Please consider what we discussed." Catherine curtsied and retreated, feeling Victoria's eyes boring into her back. As she closed the library door, she heard Victoria's voice, low and venomous. "Really, William? Consorting with servants? What would your father say?" Walking back to the servants' quarters, Catherine's mind whirled with the implications of the Duke's request. The Winchester household, once her sanctuary, was becoming a maze of conflicting loyalties and hidden agendas. And somehow, she had been thrust into the center of it all. That night, as she prepared the Duchess's chambers for bed, Catherine found herself studying her mistress with new eyes. The older woman moved slowly, pausing often to touch familiar objects, as if reassuring herself of their permanence. "You're very quiet tonight, Catherine," the Duchess observed. "Is something troubling you?" Catherine hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. "The Duke spoke with me today, Your Grace, about household economies." The Duchess stiffened. "Did he now? And what did my son have to say?" "He's concerned about your comfort during these changes, Your Grace. He wants to ensure you're prepared." A bitter laugh escaped the Duchess. "Prepared to watch everything my husband built be dismantled by that scheming Astor girl? She's poisoning his mind, Catherine. Mark my words." As Catherine helped the Duchess into bed, she couldn't help but wonder if there was truth in the warning. The mansion that had once seemed so solid, so permanent, now felt like a house of cards ready to collapse at the slightest breath. Little did she know that in just a few short days, at the glittering Christmas ball that would bring New York's elite to the Winchester mansion, her own world would come crashing down in ways she could never have imagined. For now, she simply tucked the covers around the Duchess, dimmed the lights and retreated to her own small room, unaware that her every move was being watched by eyes filled with malice and calculation. In the shadows of the grand Winchester mansion, plans were being laid that would forever change the course of Catherine Morgan's life. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, the sound of whispered conspiracies echoed through the halls, setting the stage for a betrayal that would span decades. The Winchester mansion had never looked more magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cast their ethereal glow across the grand ballroom, while hundreds of candles flickered in silver candelabras. The air was thick with the scent of winter roses and expensive perfume, mingling with the aroma of roasted pheasant and champagne. It was Christmas Eve, 1889, and New York's elite had gathered for what would become the most infamous ball in the city's history. Catherine Morgan adjusted her starched collar as she wove through the crowd, a silver tray of champagne flutes balanced perfectly on her palm. Her black uniform with its crisp white apron was immaculate, her movements careful and precise. After 2 hours of non-stop service, her feet ached in the tight leather shoes, but she maintained the invisible grace expected of Winchester staff. "More champagne for the Vanderbilts at table 3, Sarah whispered as she passed, her own tray laden with canapes. "And watch out for Mrs. Astor. She's already on her 5th glass and getting handsy with the footman." Catherine nodded, suppressing a smile. The grand dames of society might present a facade of refinement, but after enough champagne, their true natures often emerged. She navigated through the sea of silk gowns and tailored evening coats, observing the peculiar dynamics of New York's upper crust. Duke William stood near the orchestra, looking decidedly uncomfortable in his role as host. His tall frame was elegant in formal evening wear, but his eyes constantly scanned the room with an almost haunted expression. Beside him, Victoria Astor commanded attention in a gown of deep crimson that matched her lips. A deliberate choice, Catherine suspected, to stand out among the more traditionally attired ladies. As Catherine refilled glasses, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation, and simply dreadful about the Winchester finances. That Astor girl has her claws in deep. Young Duke doesn't stand a chance. The gossip swirled like cigarette smoke, each whispered confidence adding to the thick atmosphere of speculation and judgment. Catherine had learned long ago that servants were invisible to most of the upper class, who spoke freely in their presence as if they were mere furniture. The Duchess Margaret appeared precisely at 9 o'clock, descending the main staircase to polite applause. She wore black silk in deference to her recent widowhood, but around her neck gleamed the Winchester diamond, a magnificent necklace comprising 3 strands of flawless gems with a central stone the size of a quail's egg. It was more than mere jewelry. It was a symbol of the family's power and prestige, passed down through generations. Catherine happened to be near the stairs as the Duchess made her entrance. Their eyes met briefly, and Margaret gave an almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The gesture warmed Catherine's heart. In a room full of society's finest, the Duchess still recognized her trusted maid. The next hours passed in a blur of service. Catherine moved between the ballroom and the kitchen, fetching fresh glasses, replacing depleted trays, responding to increasingly demanding requests from guests whose inhibitions decreased with each passing hour. By 11 o'clock, the party was reaching its peak. Couples swirled across the dance floor to a Strauss waltz, their movements becoming less precise as the evening wore on. In the kitchen, the staff worked at a frantic pace. Mrs. Hawthorne barked orders while supervising the preparation of the midnight supper, sweat beading on her brow despite the December chill. Footmen rushed in and out, their usually impeccable appearances beginning to fray at the edges. "Catherine!" Mr. Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos. The butler's face was flushed, his normally perfect composure showing cracks. "We need you in the ladies' retiring room. Lady Morrison has had a mishap with her gown." Catherine grabbed her sewing kit, always at the ready for such emergencies, and hurried up the servants' stairs. The ladies' retiring room was a sanctuary of sorts, where female guests could escape the scrutiny of the ballroom to adjust their appearances or rest their feet. She found Lady Morrison, a stout woman in unfortunate yellow silk, nearly in tears over a torn hem. 20 minutes later, having performed emergency repairs that would have impressed a professional seamstress, Catherine was making her way back to the kitchen when she literally collided with Victoria Astor in the corridor. "Watch where you're going, girl!" Victoria snapped, steadying herself against the wall. Her perfect composure slipped for a moment, revealing something darker beneath, something that made Catherine's skin prickle with unease. "I beg your pardon, Miss Astor," Catherine murmured, dropping into a curtsy. Victoria's eyes narrowed, studying Catherine with an intensity that felt almost predatory. "You're the Duchess's pet, aren't you? The one who thinks she's better than the other servants because she can read?" Catherine kept her eyes lowered, her heart pounding. "I only try to serve the family well, miss. See that you remember your place." Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. "Everything is about to change in this house, and those who can't adapt will find themselves on the street." With that cryptic warning, Victoria swept away, leaving Catherine shaken. She took a moment to compose herself before returning to the ballroom, but the encounter left her deeply unsettled. As midnight approached, the orchestra began playing the traditional Christmas carols. The Duchess stood beside William, accepting congratulations from guests who admired the Winchester diamond. Catherine was circulating with fresh champagne when it happened. A scream pierced the music, high, sharp, and filled with genuine distress. The orchestra faltered, instruments falling silent one by one as heads turned toward the source of the commotion. The Duchess stood frozen, her hand at her throat where the diamond necklace had been moments before. "My necklace!" she cried, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "The Winchester diamond! It's gone!" Chaos erupted. Guests pressed forward to see while others stepped back in shock. Catherine watched as William rushed to his mother's side, his face ashen. Victoria appeared almost instantly, taking charge of the situation with suspicious efficiency. "Everyone remain calm," William's voice rang out, though it trembled slightly. "The doors will be secured. No one leaves until we've conducted a thorough search." What followed was a surreal hour of controlled pandemonium. The male guests were asked to empty their pockets, while ladies were discreetly searched by the housekeeper, Mrs. Egerton. The staff was separated from the guests and confined to the servants' hall. Catherine sat between Sarah and Thomas, a young footman, as Mr. Blackwood paced before them. "The reputation of this house is at stake," he intoned gravely. "If any of you knows anything at all, speak now." No one spoke. Catherine's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. She had seen the Duchess wearing the necklace shortly before midnight. How could something so valuable vanish in a room full of people? "They're searching our quarters," Sarah whispered, her face pale. "Every room, every belonging." A cold dread settled in Catherine's stomach. She thought of her small trunk tucked under her narrow bed, the only private space she had in the world. The violation of that privacy felt almost worse than being suspected of theft. The wait stretched endlessly. Catherine could hear muffled voices from upstairs, occasional raised arguments, the sound of furniture being moved. When Mr. Blackwood finally returned, his face was grimmer than she had ever seen it. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "you're to come with me immediately." Catherine rose on shaking legs, aware of the shocked stares from her fellow servants. Sarah grabbed her hand briefly, a gesture of support that nearly broke Catherine's composure. She was led not to the Duke's study as she expected, but to the main foyer where a cluster of people waited. William, Victoria, Mrs. Egerton, and 2 uniformed police officers. But it was the sight of the Duchess, seated on a chair and weeping quietly, that made Catherine's heart constrict. "Miss Morgan," William began, unable to meet her eyes. "During the search of the servants' quarters, the Winchester diamond was discovered." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible," she whispered. "It was found in your trunk, wrapped in one of your handkerchiefs," Mrs. Egerton added, her voice cold with accusation. "No." Catherine shook her head, her voice stronger now. "Your Grace, you know me. I would never—" "The evidence is clear," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "Who else would have access to the Duchess's chambers? Who else knew the routines of the household so intimately?" Catherine looked desperately at the Duchess, the woman she had served faithfully for 2 years. Margaret met her gaze, confusion and hurt warring in her tear-filled eyes. "I don't understand," the Duchess whispered. "Catherine, how could you?" "I didn't!" Catherine cried, turning to William. "Your Grace, please! Someone has done this deliberately. I've been framed!" William's jaw tightened. "The necklace was found in your possession. What other explanation could there be?" "Search again," Catherine pleaded. "Question everyone. There must be someone who saw something, some proof." "Enough!" Victoria's voice cut through her protests. "The longer we delay, the more embarrassment this brings to the family. The police are here. Let them handle this criminal." Catherine felt rough hands on her arms as the officers stepped forward. Panic rose in her throat. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare from which she would surely wake. As she was led away, she caught one final glimpse of the Duchess's face, saw the doubt that had crept into those kind eyes. It was that doubt, more than the accusation itself, that shattered something inside Catherine. "Remember this moment," she called out, as the officers pulled her toward the door. "Remember who stood by you and who condemned you without question." The last thing she saw before being dragged into the snowy night was Victoria Astor's face and the small, satisfied smile that played at the corners of her crimson lips. In that instant, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that this had been no random crime. She had been deliberately destroyed, and as the mansion doors closed behind her, shutting out the warmth and light of the only home she'd known for 2 years, Catherine Morgan made a silent vow. She would return, and when she did, the truth would finally come to light. The snow fell heavily as the police wagon pulled away from the Winchester mansion, carrying Catherine toward a fate she had never imagined. Behind her, the sounds of the ball resumed, as if nothing of consequence had happened, as if a young woman's life hadn't just been irrevocably changed by the cruelty of those who viewed her as nothing more than a disposable servant. But Catherine Morgan was far from disposable, and the seeds of her transformation had already been planted in the bitter soil of injustice. The ballroom descended into a bizarre mixture of horror and morbid fascination as the gravity of the situation sank in. The Winchester diamond, a necklace valued at more than most New Yorkers could earn in a lifetime, was missing. Catherine stood frozen near the service entrance, watching as the cream of society transformed into a mob barely contained by propriety. "No one leaves!" William's voice rose above the murmurs, his usual composure cracking. He gestured to the liveried footman standing at the doors. "Seal all exits. Thomas, fetch the police immediately." Victoria Astor was already at William's side, her crimson gown stark against his dark evening wear. "We should search the servants' quarters first," she suggested, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "The thief surely tried to hide it there." Catherine watched as Victoria's words rippled through the crowd, saw how quickly suspicion turned toward the staff. She caught Sarah's eye across the room, recognizing the same dawning horror in her friend's expression. "Ladies and gentlemen," William addressed the guests, trying to maintain a semblance of order. "We must conduct ourselves properly. Please remain in the ballroom while we organize a methodical search." Mr. Blackwood began directing the male servants to search the ground floor, while Mrs. Edgerton gathered the female staff. Catherine's heart pounded as she joined the line of maids and kitchen workers being herded toward the servants' hall. "This is outrageous," Sarah whispered as they walked, "as if any of us would be foolish enough to steal from the family." Catherine nodded numbly, her mind racing. Something about Victoria's eagerness to search the servants' quarters nagged at her. She remembered their encounter in the corridor, the threat barely veiled behind those cold eyes. In the servants' hall, the atmosphere was thick with fear and indignation. Mrs. Edgerton, who had ruled over them with iron discipline, now seemed uncertain, her authority diminished by the crisis. "You will all remain here," she announced, her voice strained. "Your quarters will be searched thoroughly. If anyone has information that might assist in recovering the necklace, speak now." Silence greeted her words. Catherine looked around at her fellow servants, Martha from the scullery, wringing her hands, James the hall boy, pale as milk, the elderly laundress, Mrs. Flynn, muttering prayers under her breath. None of them could have done this. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. They could hear footsteps overhead, doors opening and closing, furniture being moved. Catherine thought of her small room, of her few precious possessions, the books her father had given her, letters from her deceased mother, the small silver locket that was her only inheritance. The violation of that private space felt almost worse than the suspicion itself. "Miss Morgan!" Mr. Blackwood's voice echoed from the doorway, his face ashen. You're to come with me. Now." Catherine's legs felt like lead as she rose. The other servants' eyes followed her, some sympathetic, others already calculating the implications. Sarah reached out, squeezing her hand briefly. "Remember who you are," Sarah whispered. "Stand tall." The walk to the main foyer felt like a journey to the gallows. Catherine's mind kept returning to Victoria's words from earlier. Everything is about to change in this house. Had this been what she meant? The scene that greeted her in the foyer was surreal. William stood rigid, his face a mask of confusion and anger. Victoria hovered behind him, her expression carefully composed, but with a glint in her eyes that made Catherine's blood run cold. The Duchess sat slumped in a chair, her evening gown crumpled, tears streaming down her powdered cheeks. Between them, on a small table, lay the Winchester diamond, still nested in the folds of a white lace handkerchief. "Miss Morgan," William began, his voice tight, "this necklace was discovered in your quarters, hidden in your personal trunk." "That's impossible," Catherine said immediately, her voice stronger than she felt. "Your Grace, I've never even been alone with the necklace. How could I have taken it?" "The evidence speaks for itself," Victoria interjected smoothly. "It was found wrapped in one of your handkerchiefs, tucked beneath your clothing." Catherine turned to the Duchess, her eyes pleading. "Your Grace, you know me. I've served you faithfully for 2 years. Please, you must believe—" "Catherine," the Duchess interrupted, her voice broken. "The necklace was in your trunk. How else could it have gotten there? Someone placed it there." Catherine's voice rose with desperation. "Someone who wanted to frame me." "And who would do such a thing?" Victoria asked, her tone patronizing. "What possible motive could anyone have to frame a simple maid?" The trap was so perfectly laid that Catherine could barely breathe. She looked around the foyer, seeing doubt on every face. William wouldn't meet her eyes. Mrs. Edgerton stood stiffly by the stairs, her expression condemning. Only the 2 police officers, newly arrived, showed any neutrality, and even they seemed to have already formed their conclusions. "Your Grace," Catherine turned back to William, forcing herself to remain calm. "Please consider this logically. If I had stolen the necklace, would I be foolish enough to hide it in my own trunk? Would I not have fled immediately rather than continue serving at the ball?" For a moment, she saw hesitation flicker across William's face. But Victoria was quick to step in. "Classic criminal behavior," she declared. "Thieves often hide their plunder close by, believing they can retrieve it later when suspicion dies down. And staying at the ball would seem less suspicious than fleeing, wouldn't it?" The logic was twisted but persuasive, and Catherine watched helplessly as William's moment of doubt passed. He straightened, assuming the full authority of his title. "Catherine Morgan, you have betrayed the trust of this household," he said formally. "The evidence is clear and irrefutable. You are hereby dismissed without reference and will be turned over to the authorities." "No!" Catherine cried out, her composure finally breaking. "Your Grace, please, I'm innocent. Someone has done this deliberately to ruin me." She looked desperately at the Duchess, but Margaret's eyes were filled with hurt and confusion. "I trusted you," the Duchess whispered. "I fought for you when others said you were too clever for a servant, and you repay me with this?" The words struck Catherine like physical blows. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she forced them back. She would not give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing her break down completely. "Search my room again," she pleaded. "Question everyone who was in the corridor tonight. There must be witnesses, some evidence." "The investigation is over," William cut her off. "Officers, please remove this woman from my house." As the policeman stepped forward, Catherine made one last desperate appeal. "William, Your Grace, someone orchestrated this. Someone who wants to see me destroyed. Ask yourself why—" "Enough!" Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. "The girl is clearly unstable, inventing wild conspiracies to cover her guilt. Remove her at once." Rough hands gripped Catherine's arms. As she was dragged toward the door, she caught one final glimpse of Victoria's face. The mask had slipped for just an instant, revealing naked triumph in those cold eyes. "This isn't over," Catherine called out, as she was pulled into the freezing December night. "The truth will come out, and when it does, you'll all see who the real criminal is." The last thing she saw before the mansion doors slammed shut was the Duchess's face, crumpled with grief and betrayal. It was an image that would haunt Catherine for years to come. The moment when someone she had genuinely cared for believed the worst of her. The police wagon waited at the curb, its iron bars gleaming dully in the streetlight. As Catherine was roughly pushed inside, she caught a glimpse of movement at one of the upper windows. Sarah stood there, her face pressed against the glass, tears visible even from this distance. The wagon lurched forward, carrying Catherine away from the only home she'd known in New York. Behind her, the Winchester mansion blazed with light, the sounds of the resumed ball floating on the winter air as if nothing of consequence had occurred. But as Catherine huddled in the corner of the wagon, shivering in her thin uniform, she felt something harder than grief settle in her heart. This was not the end. This was merely the first chapter in a story that would span decades. She thought of her father's words, spoken on his deathbed. "Knowledge is power, Catherine. They can take everything else from you, but never your mind." In that moment, as the city's gas lamps flickered past, Catherine Morgan made a vow. She would return, not as a servant seeking mercy, but as an equal demanding justice. However long it took, whatever sacrifices were required, she would expose the truth and make those who had wronged her answer for their actions. The wagon turned down a darker street, heading toward the jail, where she would spend Christmas Eve in a cold cell. But Catherine barely noticed. Her mind was already racing ahead, planning for a future that her accusers could never imagine. Victoria Astor might have won this battle, but the war was far from over. And Catherine Morgan, despite her current circumstances, knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would have her revenge. The mansion doors slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed louder than the howling wind. Snow whipped across Catherine's face, stinging her skin like 1,000 tiny needles. She staggered slightly, the sudden blast of frigid air knocking the breath from her lungs. Her uniform, meant for indoor duties, offered no protection against the bitter December night. She turned instinctively, eyes darting upward to the second floor, and there he was, William. He stood behind the frost-glazed window, partially obscured by the heavy velvet curtains. His silhouette was motionless, rigid. Only the faintest glow of the chandelier behind him illuminated his face. Their eyes met, hers filled with betrayal, his unreadable. In that brief exchange, words were unnecessary. The silence between them screamed louder than anything either could say. And then he turned away. Catherine's breath hitched. She felt the betrayal like a blade between her ribs. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't call her name. He simply turned. The cold became suddenly unbearable. She stumbled forward, boots crunching against the snow, her breath coming in ragged clouds. With every step, her body shivered more violently. She hadn't even been allowed to take her coat, let alone her gloves. Her fingers were already numb. Her lips trembled not just from the cold, but from the enormity of what had just occurred. She had been cast out, not just fired, but expelled, discarded, like refuse. And with no money, no references, no family. She was utterly alone. Behind her, inside the warmth and grandeur of the Winchester mansion, Sarah Sullivan clutched the window frame in disbelief. She had watched the entire scene unfold from the shadows of the servants' corridor. Her knuckles whitened as her hands gripped the windowsill. "I swear to God I'll help you," she whispered into the darkness. "Whatever it takes." But at that moment, she could do nothing. She was just another servant in a world where loyalty was crushed beneath silver candlesticks and diamond necklaces. Outside, Catherine made it to the edge of the estate. Her body screamed for warmth, for rest, for shelter, but her mind, still ablaze with disbelief and humiliation, pushed her forward. Each breath scraped her throat. She tried to pull the shawl tighter around her, but the thin wool barely held together. The snow had soaked through it in minutes. Her thin shoes were already caked with slush. A carriage passed nearby, sending up a spray of snow and mud. The driver didn't slow down. She turned into a narrow alley, seeking refuge from the wind. There, between two brick buildings, she collapsed against the wall, gasping. Tears spilled down her cheeks and froze almost instantly. Memories came in flashes, her father's laughter, her mother's lullabies. The first time she walked up the grand staircase of the mansion with a feather duster in hand and stars in her eyes. The pride she felt the day the Duchess had asked her to tend to her personally. The whispered dreams she and Sarah had shared late at night of someday becoming independent, opening a small shop or bookstore. And now, all of it gone. Hours passed. The city around her seemed oblivious to her suffering. Couples hurried past in fur coats, cab drivers shouted over the snow, church bells tolled midnight. Christmas Eve. She shuddered at the cruel irony. She couldn't stay here. She had to move. Somewhere. Anywhere. Her fingers brushed her apron pocket. Empty. No coins, no letters. Even her locket, the one her father had given her, had been left behind in the room she might never see again. She needed help. But who would help a disgraced servant thrown out in scandal? She thought of one person. Sarah Sullivan moved quickly and carefully through the dim halls of the mansion. She avoided the main stairwell, where the last of the guests were departing, slipping instead through the narrow servants' paths. In the laundry room, she opened a small compartment beneath a loose floorboard. Inside were a few coins, a pair of gloves, and a worn shawl. She didn't hesitate. Minutes later, Sarah emerged from the servants' entrance cloaked in shadow, boots crunching in the snow as she followed Catherine's trail down the avenue. Catherine had reached the edge of Central Park. The snowstorm had blanketed the world in eerie silence. Trees stood like skeletal sentinels. A single gas lamp flickered nearby, casting ghostly shadows across the drifts. She collapsed onto a bench, unable to go further. Her entire body was shaking now. She was slipping. Sleep beckoned, and with it danger. Footsteps. She stirred, eyes fluttering. Had she imagined it? No, there was someone. A tall figure stepped from the shadows, male, cloaked, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Catherine tensed. Was this it? Would she be robbed? Attacked? But the figure simply approached slowly and laid something beside her. A wool blanket. A tin flask. And then, without a word, he vanished back into the darkness. She clutched the blanket instinctively, wrapping it around herself. The flask, warm, tea perhaps, sweet, spiced. She drank greedily. And then she wept again, not from fear, but from the strange mercy of an anonymous soul. Hours later, just before dawn, Sarah found her on the bench. Pale, still shivering, but alive. "Catherine!" she gasped, running to her side. "Thank God!" Catherine blinked up at her, dazed. "Sarah!" "I'm here," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside her. She placed the gloves on Catherine's hands, wrapped her in the second shawl. "We have to get you somewhere warm." "Where?" "I know a place. It's not much, but it's safe." By mid-morning, Catherine lay on a straw mattress in the back room of an old boarding house run by a kindly Irish widow. The fire was small, but it felt like heaven. Sarah sat beside her, holding her hand. "They've already begun to spread the story," Sarah said bitterly, "about the necklace, about you." Catherine's jaw clenched. "I expected it. They'll try to ruin you, Catherine. They already did." Sarah paused, then added, "But they haven't broken you." Catherine looked into the flames. "No," she whispered. "They haven't." And somewhere, deep within the heart of Manhattan, in a candle-lit room of his own, William Winchester stood at the same window where he'd last seen her. His thoughts were scattered, his conscience was loud. Why did he look? Why did he not stop it? A part of him, small but persistent, whispered, "Because you knew something wasn't right, but you let it happen." The snow fell thicker now, and for the first time in years, the great Winchester estate felt empty. The days that followed were some of the darkest Catherine Morgan had ever known. The tiny back room of Mrs. Callahan's boarding house, though warm and dry, felt like a prison carved from grief. Her body ached, her pride was in tatters, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw William's face at the window, cold, distant, and final. The memory would visit her often, but instead of breaking her, it began to harden something inside her. Each morning, Sarah brought her food, whispers from the mansion, and reminders that not all hope was lost. "They're calling you a thief, yes," Sarah confessed one morning, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. "But some of the staff, they don't believe it. Mrs. Flynn swears you'd never do such a thing, and Thomas, he says the whole thing feels too neat." Catherine nodded, clutching her tea. It was too perfect. The necklace, it was never supposed to be found. "Victoria," Sarah said bitterly, "she's already taking your place in the Duchess's social life, sits beside William like she's the mistress of the house." The words stabbed deep, but Catherine only pressed her lips together. Let her enjoy her victory. It won't last. Weeks passed. Catherine found herself walking through Lower Manhattan one bitter morning, searching for something she could not name. A purpose, a way back, a door not yet closed. She had no resume, no contacts. Her name had been blackened in the very circles she once served. Every door she knocked on shut quickly once they recognized her face or name. Then she met Edward Montgomery. It was a chance encounter, or perhaps fate. Catherine was outside the courthouse, watching a man plead with a police officer for leniency on behalf of a child accused of pickpocketing. The boy was no older than 10, filthy and terrified. "Sir, please, he's not a criminal," the man said. "He's hungry." The officer scoffed, raising a baton. Catherine, without thinking, stepped forward. "Stop! He's just a child." The officer looked at her like she was mad. "You interfering?" "Call it what you like," Catherine said calmly, stepping between the officer and the boy. "But if you strike him, you'll answer for it." The voice behind her was calm but authoritative. "She's right, and you'll leave that child alone, or you'll be answering to me." Edward Montgomery appeared like a force of nature, tall, lean, with sharp eyes, and a voice that cut through tension like a knife through silk. He produced a legal badge, and in minutes the boy was released to a shelter. Catherine watched in awe. Edward turned to her, adjusting his gloves. "You've got courage and instincts. What's your name?" "Catherine Morgan." Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, curiosity, but he said nothing of her past. "Ever considered working for a lawyer?" Her new life began in a cluttered office on Bleecker Street. The Montgomery Law Office was a haven for the unwanted. Children caught in petty crime, immigrants denied housing, women unfairly dismissed or abused. Edward, a man of privilege who chose the path of justice over comfort, became her mentor. At first, Catherine handled simple tasks, organizing files, typing letters, but Edward quickly saw her hunger. Her mind, starved of stimulation for weeks, devoured every legal brief, every case summary. She stayed after hours reading court transcripts by candlelight, taking notes in the margins, asking questions no clerk had dared before. "You've got a fire in you," Edward told her one night. "Whatever your past, it doesn't define your future. You have a mind meant for more." He offered her books, philosophy, economics, case law, and, at her request, business and trade. She devoured them all. 5 years passed like a storm sweeping through steel. Catherine never took a day for granted. She worked from dawn until the gaslights were extinguished, saving every cent she could from her modest wages. She ate simply, dressed plainly, and made notes of everything. Successful storefronts, real estate patterns, trade routes through the Hudson, the behavior of customers in every district. She wasn't merely surviving, she was building. On the surface, she remained the quiet assistant of a progressive lawyer, but beneath, she was charting her ascent. She registered night classes under a false surname, learned accounting from an old Italian grocer in exchange for translating court documents, sat in on public business lectures, and took detailed notes. Sarah, meanwhile, continued her quiet resistance. Still in service at the Winchester mansion, she moved like a ghost. Victoria never suspected her loyalty lay elsewhere. Sarah listened, observed, and wrote. She sent her letters carefully, coded through innocent phrases and poems that Catherine had taught her. The Winchester house was no longer a fortress, but a chessboard, and Sarah was Catherine's rook. Her letters chronicled William's growing silence, his increasing absence from social life, the financial missteps of Victoria's influence. She noted servants dismissed for questioning the theft, whispers among footmen of Victoria's late-night visitors, gamblers mostly. "She's bleeding the household," Sarah wrote, "but William doesn't see it, or he doesn't want to." Catherine read the letters by firelight, her face composed, but her mind burning with strategy. Victoria was slipping. The same ambition that led her to frame Catherine was now driving her to ruin. It was only a matter of time. One spring morning, Catherine stood before the modest storefront she had purchased anonymously through a broker, a 2-story brick building on Fifth Avenue, wedged between a silk importer and a tobacconist. Morgan Emporium, the freshly painted sign read. It was a risk, her entire savings. But Catherine had studied the market meticulously. New York's working women were gaining power, and they lacked elegant, affordable goods tailored to their needs. Catherine's vision was clear, a department store that treated female customers with dignity. Items priced fairly, sourced from ethical artisans, staffed by women trained in business, not just sales. It wasn't just a store, it was a statement. Edward stood beside her as the first customers trickled in that May morning. "You've done it," he said simply. "Most people would have crumbled under what you endured." Catherine watched a young mother smile as she tried on a silk glove. "I didn't survive to be a cautionary tale," she replied. "I survived to build something they can't ignore." That night, in the quiet of her office above the store, Catherine lit a single candle and opened her notebook. Inside, her plans had grown sharper, bolder. Expansion to a second location, strategic partnerships with female-run workshops, a fund for domestic workers who were unfairly dismissed just like her. And at the very back of the notebook, on a page she barely touched, was one word, written in careful ink: justice. As the summer of 1894 began, the city was buzzing with change. New women's clubs, labor strikes, whispers of suffrage, and beneath it all, Catherine Morgan, once a disgraced maid, was becoming something else, a force, a name, and soon a reckoning. 10 years, a decade had passed since the snow fell like knives on her skin, since the iron bars of the police wagon clanged shut, since the fire that had ignited in her chest refused to die. And now, Catherine Morgan returned, but not as the trembling girl thrown into the night. She returned as Madame Morgan, founder of Morgan Emporium, New York's most elegant and ethical department store, praised in editorials, frequented by socialites, and whispered about in gentlemen's clubs as the shop that changed everything. Where once her name was spoken in hushed scandal, now it commanded respect in business circles. Where once she had been locked out of every opportunity, now she walked through gilded doors by invitation. Her past still lived within her, but now it wore silk gloves and calculated poise. The invitation arrived on a rainy Tuesday, printed on thick ivory parchment, the edges gilded in real gold leaf. The Winchester Foundation cordially invites you to an evening of benevolence and culture in support of orphan relief across the 5 boroughs. Catherine turned the card over in her hands, her lips curling into a small, unreadable smile. Victoria's name was listed among the hosts, William Winchester's as honorary patron. "It's time," she whispered. The ballroom of the Metropolitan Society for the Arts was a cavernous hall of crystal chandeliers, white marble floors, and champagne dreams. Music floated through the air like perfume, soft, practiced, and perfectly inoffensive. Catherine stood at the edge of it all, clad in a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered with every breath of light. Her hair, pinned in an elegant twist, revealed a single diamond at her throat. Not the Winchester diamond, no, a simpler piece, gifted by a French designer who owed his career to her patronage. She moved through the room like a current of still water, silent but impossible to ignore. Eyes followed her. Men offered polite bows. Women whispered her name with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. "That's Madame Morgan. She owns the Emporium. I heard she started with nothing." William Winchester was late. He arrived nearly an hour after the first toast, dressed impeccably in tailored evening wear. Still the image of nobility, still handsome in a cold, distant way, but older now, slight lines at the corners of his eyes, shadows beneath them that suggested more sleepless nights than a man of his wealth should know. He made the usual rounds, kisses on gloved hands, firm handshakes, murmured compliments, until he paused near the balcony. That's when he saw her, from across the room, Catherine. But he didn't recognize her, not yet. To him, she was just another radiant figure amid crystal and gold. She turned, caught his gaze, and smiled. He approached slowly. A waiter passed, and he took 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to her. "I don't believe we've met," he said. "William Winchester. Madame Catherine Morgan." The name meant nothing to him at first. He raised his glass. "I've heard of Morgan Emporium. My mother swears by your Parisian silk department. She has good taste," he chuckled lightly, "and an impressive eye. I must say it's rare to see a woman dominate New York's business world without so much as a scandal to her name." She tilted her head. "Not all scandals make it to print, Mr. Winchester. Some are simply erased." He narrowed his eyes, sensing something. A tone, a familiarity. "I'm sure I would remember meeting you," he said, searching her face. "You look vaguely familiar." Catherine sipped her champagne, her voice honeyed and sharp. "Perhaps in another life." Victoria Astor swept toward them in a cloud of perfume and envy. Her gown, though expensive, felt somehow gaudy beside Catherine's refined elegance. "William," she purred, "there you are." Her eyes landed on Catherine, and in an instant her mask faltered, just for a breath. Catherine saw it. Victoria knew the moment had come. "Madame Morgan," Victoria said tightly, forcing a smile. "What a surprise to see you here." "I received an invitation," Catherine said lightly. "Wasn't it generous of your foundation to welcome someone of my background?" Victoria's eyes flickered dangerously. "Indeed, the foundation is known for its compassion." William glanced between them, the confusion on his face growing. "You two have met?" Catherine turned to him fully, her expression composed, regal. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, this time with unmistakable weight on the words. "We've met before." Silence fell like snow. William's glass lowered, his brows drew together, his breath caught. And then, as if a veil had been lifted, he saw her. Not Madame Morgan, not the merchant queen. But the girl in the snow, the maid at the ball, the one he condemned, the memory hit him like a blow. "Catherine," he said, barely above a whisper. Catherine met his gaze, calm and unflinching. "It seems you do remember." The room around them carried on, music, laughter, clinking glasses. But in that small triangle of silence, the air thickened. Victoria's face paled, her fingers tightening around her fan. William stepped back slightly. "But how? How did I survive?" Catherine said, her voice steady. "How did I build a business, a name, a life, after being thrown into the street like a thief?" She leaned closer. "The answer is simple, William. I refused to disappear." Victoria attempted to regain control, her voice high with false cheer. "Let's not dredge up old misunderstandings. It was all so long ago." Catherine turned to her with a smile that never touched her eyes. "Misunderstandings can ruin lives, Miss Astor. But then again, some people don't mind a little collateral damage when it suits their ambitions." Gasps rippled near them, just faint enough to feed the rumors. William looked stricken. "Catherine, I didn't know, I never imagined." "You didn't want to know," she cut in. "You had doubts, but you let them drown beneath a tide of influence and fear. You chose silence, and I paid for it." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were scalpel precise, and they landed. A waiter passed. Catherine placed her glass on the tray and turned away. "I won't take more of your time," she said to no one in particular. "After all, this is a night for benevolence." With that, she walked away, each step measured, graceful, final. She didn't look back. Later that night, the city lights shimmered in the windows of her private carriage. Catherine sat in silence, staring out into the dark. Sarah sat across from her, hands folded in her lap. "He saw you," Sarah said gently, "the real you." Catherine nodded slowly. "Yes, and now he'll have to live with it." "Do you think he regrets it?" "I hope he does," Catherine said, "but regret isn't justice." She turned back to the window, her voice like a promise. "Justice is coming." Rain fell softly on the cobbled streets of New York that evening, whispering against gas lamps, pooling at the feet of horse-drawn carriages, and weaving shadows into the alleyways like secrets waiting to be uncovered. Catherine stood at the corner of Madison and 43rd, her gloved hands folded tightly in front of her. She wore a deep navy cloak with a velvet collar, her face concealed beneath the brim of a wide hat. She wasn't there to shop or be seen. She was waiting. And when the carriage arrived, black, unmarked, discreet, she stepped in without hesitation. Inside, the man she had summoned was already seated. Lean frame, salt and pepper hair, a trench coat that looked more like armor than fashion. Eyes like twin razors, dark and unblinking. James Thompson, the best private investigator in the city, perhaps the entire East Coast. "Madame Morgan," he said with a slight nod. "I've read about you in the Tribune." Catherine offered a faint smile. "And yet you agreed to meet me in person. You requested absolute discretion," he replied. "That intrigued me more than your reputation." She leaned slightly forward, her tone shifting to ice and iron. "I need you to investigate a crime that occurred 10 years ago, a theft, a setup, a life destroyed." James raised an eyebrow. "Cold cases are difficult. Memories fade. Evidence disappears." "Not when the criminal is still very much active," Catherine said. "And careless." Over the next hour, Catherine laid it all out. The stolen Winchester diamond, the mysterious appearance of the necklace in her trunk, the expulsion, the accusations, the silence of a once trusted man, and the woman behind it all, Victoria Astor. James Thompson didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his hands steepled, eyes sharp and calculating. "And what makes you so certain Miss Astor was behind the theft?" he asked finally. "Because she told me," Catherine said, voice like smoke. Not in words, but in the way she smiled when I was thrown out, in the way she watched me at the benefit because she wanted me gone, and she got what she wanted. James considered this, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notepad. "Very well," he said. "I'll begin with her financial records, known associates, travel habits. If there's a pattern, I'll find it. But if you want proof, solid proof, you'll need to let me dig deep." Catherine met his gaze. "Dig as deep as you need. I want the truth, and I want it to burn." Within days, Thompson's web of informants began to pull threads from the tapestry of Victoria Astor's perfect social mask. By the third week, the pattern had become clear. Victoria had cultivated a reputation for generosity and elegance among the upper class. But behind the velvet facade was a rotting foundation. Gambling, that was her poison. Private salons in Brooklyn, secret dice games in Chinatown, weekly trips to illegal betting houses in Jersey. James tracked her through coded invitations and discreet transactions. He uncovered IOUs signed under aliases, some with names that matched dismissed Winchester staff, blackmailed into silence. And worse, this wasn't the first time someone had been framed. In 1891, a scullery maid named Esther Hollings was dismissed after a valuable silver heirloom went missing. 2 weeks later, it was discovered in her brother's apartment, a brother struggling to pay off a sudden debt. In 1893, a footman named Harold Green was accused of stealing Duchess Margaret's pearl earrings. He disappeared from the city entirely. Rumor said he'd been seen begging near the piers, his spirit shattered. Victoria had orchestrated a pattern of thefts, all timed with her worst betting losses, and each time the blame was neatly shifted to a servant, their lives ruined, their names erased. Catherine read the reports in stunned silence. "She didn't just destroy me," she whispered. "She built her fortune on the backs of the powerless." James nodded. "That's how parasites survive. But now we have names, victims, records. We're building a case." Catherine looked up slowly. Now it's time to bait the trap. The plan was elegant, devious, a mirror of Victoria's own methods. Catherine would approach Victoria under the guise of an investor, one with vast capital and an interest in exclusive, high-risk ventures. She would appeal to Victoria's greed, her vanity, and most of all, her desperation. Sarah, still inside the Winchester household, fed them information from the inside. Victoria's latest losses at a racing club in Albany, her failed attempt to sell family heirlooms through a third party, the whispers among staff that Victoria had been quietly pressuring William for more control of the family's estate accounts. "She's drowning," Sarah wrote in one letter, "but too proud to admit it. If you offer her a lifeboat, she'll grab it." The meeting took place in a private salon at the Astoria Club. Velvet-lined walls, gilded mirrors, and an air thick with perfumes and lies. Victoria arrived in crimson silk, her expression wary but intrigued. Catherine greeted her with perfect civility, no trace of malice. She introduced herself as an entrepreneur looking to diversify her portfolio. "I hear you've connections in circles that rarely appear on stock reports," she said with a subtle wink. Victoria's mask flickered, but only for a moment. "I deal in opportunities," she replied coolly, "some more delicate than others." Over brandy and caviar, Catherine probed gently, flattered, asked questions without seeming too eager. She allowed Victoria to lead the dance, only stepping in when she needed to direct it subtly toward confession. Victoria, drunk on ego and illusion, obliged. By the third meeting, she was talking openly. "Men think they own the world," she said with a laugh, swirling her drink. "But they gamble worse than any of us. They just do it with names instead of money." She leaned closer. "There's an art to misdirection, you know, especially when you need to clean up a little mess and make someone else take the fall." Catherine tilted her head. "Surely you don't mean..." actually framing someone. Victoria smirked. Let's just say, when you have to choose between paying a debt or losing your place at the table, you learn how to be creative. She thought it was a joke, a clever line. She didn't know the room was wired. James Thompson sat in the apartment above, wearing headphones connected to the hidden phonograph needle beneath the table. Every word was being recorded on wax cylinder. At the fifth meeting, Victoria grew bolder. I once made a diamond disappear in plain sight, she bragged, then made it reappear exactly where it would do the most damage. Catherine laughed lightly. That's almost theatrical. Oh, darling, Victoria said, sipping her wine. Everything I do is theatre. Later that night, in a small room behind Morgan Emporium, Catherine and James listened to the playback. Her heart pounded with every syllable. The voice was unmistakably Victoria's. The confessions were clear, enough to tear her world apart. James leaned back. That's the ball game. Catherine stared at the phonograph, emotion rising in her chest like a wave. Vindication, anger, justice, relief, all crashing together. I want it done right, she said. No spectacle, no tabloids. She will fall exactly as I did, publicly, irreversibly. And William? James asked. She looked away. He'll learn the truth the way I did, when it's too late to stop it. The plan was ready. The truth had a voice, and the reckoning had a name. Victoria Astor had written her own downfall in her own words, and Catherine Morgan, once a broken servant in the snow, was now the architect of justice. The invitation was printed on black parchment, embossed in gold, elegant, understated, final. The honor of your presence is requested at a private evening of reflection and gratitude, hosted at Winchester Manor. Friday, 8 o'clock in the evening, formal attire required, no name, no reason, no hint of who had orchestrated it. Yet the entire upper crust of New York's high society responded with enthusiasm. After all, the Winchester estate had been sealed off from society events for years. Quiet rumors of mismanagement, fading wealth, and scandalous debts gave it a ghostly air. The idea of a return, a revival, was irresistible. Victoria Astor, of course, accepted. She believed it a sign that William had finally regained his senses, that the mansion once again would be hers to command. She wore silver, satin imported from Vienna, with hand-sewn pearls. She made sure no one outshone her, not tonight, but when she stepped into the foyer, something felt wrong. The hall was pristine, cleaner than it had ever been under her watch. The chandeliers sparkled, the scent of polished wood and fresh lilies lingered in the air. It didn't feel like home. It felt like judgment. Catherine stood at the top of the grand staircase, hidden in the shadowed corridor, watching them arrive. She saw William, dignified as ever, dressed in black with a matching expression. He moved with habitual grace, but his eyes betrayed weariness. She saw former aristocrats, old money clinging to relevance. She saw socialites and industrialists, fashion magnates and newspaper barons, all of them unaware that they were stepping into a theater and the curtain was about to rise. She inhaled deeply. The house that once cast her out was now hers, and tonight, justice would echo through its marble halls. At precisely 8 o'clock, the music stopped. The crowd hushed. The double doors to the ballroom opened. Catherine Morgan entered, not in servant's black, but in regal midnight blue. Her gown shimmered like starlight. At her throat, a silver pendant. On her face, no smile, only purpose. She walked to the center of the room and turned to face the crowd. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was calm, controlled, amplified by the eerie silence. "My name is Madame Catherine Morgan." A ripple of recognition passed through the room. A few gasps. One or two whispered, "She's the one," but she raised a hand. "You were invited here not for pleasantries, but for truth. 10 years ago, in this very room, I was accused of a crime I did not commit. I was cast out, silenced, erased. Her gaze swept the crowd. Several guests were visibly uncomfortable now. But tonight, I return not as the accused, she continued. I return as the owner of this estate and as the bearer of truth. Murmurs became louder. Victoria, frozen in place, gripped her champagne flute so tightly it cracked. Catherine turned toward the corner of the ballroom, where a long velvet table had been prepared. At this table are documents, statements, financial ledgers, eyewitness testimonies, and... She paused, looking directly at Victoria. A confession. James Thompson, dressed in a simple black suit, stepped forward and placed a wax cylinder on the phonograph beside the table. As the device crackled to life, Victoria's own voice filled the room, laughing, bragging. There's an art to misdirection. I once made a diamond disappear in plain sight. A single sentence, sharp as a guillotine. When you have to choose between paying a debt or losing your place at the table, you learn how to be creative. Gasps. Several guests turned to look at Victoria. William's eyes widened. Ladies and gentlemen, Catherine continued, Victoria Astor didn't just frame me. She framed countless others, innocent men and women whose only crime was being invisible. She did it to cover her gambling debts, to maintain her illusion of power, and she did it without remorse. Victoria stepped forward, her voice trembling. This is outrageous. You have no right. I have every right, Catherine interrupted, voice rising. This house is mine, and tonight so is the truth. She nodded to the side. Two former servants stepped forward, Esther Hollings and Harold Green, both dismissed under scandal years ago. They had returned, dignified, redeemed. I was accused of theft and lost everything, Esther said, voice clear, but I never stole anything. I was threatened, silenced. Harold added, Victoria offered me money to disappear, and when I refused, she spread lies until I was run out of the city. Their presence, living proof, broke whatever remained of Victoria's facade. She snapped. This is nothing but revenge, she shrieked. She's a bitter maid trying to claw her way into our world. She forged this, all of it. But her voice only made her smaller. Catherine stepped closer. No, Victoria, this is what justice looks like, not forged, not imagined, earned. The silence returned, heavier this time. Then William stepped forward. He looked at Catherine, then at Victoria, and finally at the guests. I believe her, he said simply. A wave of murmurs passed through the room again, but William's voice didn't shake. I had doubts once, but I let them drown in convenience. I let myself be blind when I should have questioned. Tonight, I won't make that mistake again. Victoria stared at him. William, but he stepped back, away from her, toward Catherine. I failed you, he said softly, but you didn't fail yourself. Catherine didn't respond. Her silence said everything. By the end of the night, Victoria Astor had become a ghost. No one stood beside her, no one defended her. Within days, the newspapers ran the story. Heiress Astor exposed in scandal of the decade. Debts surfaced, sponsors fled, social clubs removed her name from membership, and within the week she boarded a ship to Europe under a false name, never to return. As for Catherine, she didn't gloat, she didn't celebrate. She walked the halls of the mansion she now owned and remembered every step she'd taken to reach this moment. Every night she'd gone hungry, every page she'd studied, every tear she hadn't let fall. Sarah met her at the top of the stairs. You did it, she said, voice full of wonder. Catherine looked down at the ballroom. No, she replied quietly. We did. In the drawing room, William waited. He rose as she entered. May I speak? She nodded carefully. I don't ask for forgiveness, he began. Not yet, maybe not ever. But if there is anything I can do to right the wrongs, tell me. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, then spoke. Don't apologize. Act. Use your name, your wealth, your position. Help those you once turned away from. William straightened. I will. She nodded, then left the room. She had won, but more than that, she had reclaimed her name. Catherine Morgan was no longer a servant, no longer a victim. She was a force, and the world would never forget her again. The days following Victoria's fall passed like a storm that had finally broken, leaving the city stunned in its aftermath. Newspapers covered every angle of the scandal. Heiress fled the country, false accusations unveiled, Madame Morgan vindicated. Catherine's name, once smeared in whispers, now appeared in bold type above the fold. But inside Morgan Emporium, among the silk aisles and quiet strength of her success, Catherine Morgan felt no triumph, only stillness. Justice had been served, the truth exposed. But some wounds bled beyond justice, some scars only silence could touch. It was in that silence that William Winchester came. He arrived without announcement, stepping into the Emporium like a shadow from a distant life. Dressed in a simple grey coat, no entourage, no crest, only a man carrying the weight of what he had done. The store manager approached with confusion. Sir, do you have an appointment with Madame Morgan? I don't, William said quietly, but I will wait. And wait he did. For nearly an hour, seated on a velvet bench between imported satchels and a collection of French parasols. Customers came and went, glancing occasionally at the man who bore the unmistakable posture of aristocracy, but none spoke. Then she appeared, Catherine, poised, calm, wrapped in black silk and dignity. She stopped the moment she saw him, her gaze unwavering. You came, she said. He rose, his voice low. May I speak with you? A pause, then, follow me. She led him through a private corridor, past the office and storerooms, to a quiet library above the Emporium. The room smelled of polished wood and old paper. The fire was low, casting long shadows on the walls. William stepped inside and turned to her, but she didn't sit. She remained standing near the hearth, hands clasped. He removed his gloves, swallowed, and knelt before her, not for drama, but because it was the only posture that felt honest. I wronged you, he began, his voice trembling. Not just in the moment I accused you, but in every moment I chose silence over truth. Catherine said nothing. I had doubts, he continued, even that night. Something in me knew it wasn't right, but I was too weak. I let Victoria's poison seep into my judgment. I let my family's expectations blind me. And you paid the price. Her gaze was steady, unyielding. He lowered his head. I'm sorry, he whispered. Not because of what people now know, but because I knew and still did nothing. He raised his eyes, the fire flickering in their glassy surface. I don't ask for your forgiveness, he said. I don't deserve it, but I need to say these words to the woman I failed. Catherine's breath caught, but only for a second. Then she spoke, her voice like carved stone. You're right, you don't deserve it. He didn't flinch. You stood by while I was dragged from your home, she continued. You let them erase me. And when you suspected the truth, you chose silence, because it was easier, because your comfort mattered more than my innocence. I know, he said. She took a step closer. I don't want your sorrow, she said. I want your action. Your guilt doesn't serve the world, but your name, your wealth, your influence, they do. She stared into him, unblinking. If you want to make amends, she said, then prove it, not to me, to the world you helped keep unjust. A pause. Use the power you were born into to lift those who were crushed by it. Silence. And then, William nodded. Not a grand gesture, not a promise uttered in flowery language, just a quiet, resolute nod. I will, he said. Tell me where to begin. In the weeks that followed, the city watched in disbelief as William Winchester began a transformation no one could have predicted. He dismissed half the board members of Winchester Holdings, men who had exploited factory workers, manipulated wages, and silenced dissent. He liquidated parts of the family estate to create a new venture, the Morgan Winchester Foundation, co-founded with Catherine, its purpose clear: to fund the education and protection of domestic workers across the state. Scholarships, legal defense programs, housing support, a publication that gave voice to servants and tradespeople alike. The elite scoffed, the press mocked, but William never flinched. He stood beside labor leaders, sat through union meetings, walked unannounced into workshops, and asked workers what they needed. He became a different man. Not because Catherine loved him, but because she challenged him to become someone worth loving. Catherine didn't make it easy. She watched his progress with skeptical eyes, never once letting sentiment blind her. One afternoon, as they reviewed applications for the foundation's first round of grants, he looked up from the papers and said quietly, "You once told me that I had chosen silence over truth, that you didn't want my guilt." She looked at him. "You were right," he said, "but I don't carry that guilt now for you. I carry it for the man I used to be." Catherine didn't speak, but she didn't turn away. In time, letters poured in, from young girls in upstate New York who had finished school because of the foundation, from women who had started their own businesses after years of domestic servitude, from families who had been reunited after unjust arrests. Every letter was a testament, not to redemption, but to transformation. One day, Sarah entered Catherine's office with an envelope. "From him," she said simply. Inside was a check, not to Catherine, but to a new project. The envelope was thin, no message, just a note scribbled on the back of a ledger. "It's not repayment. It's a beginning. WW." Catherine smiled softly. Months later, they stood together on the steps of the Foundation's first learning center. Catherine wore ivory, her hair pulled back in a simple twist. William, now slimmer, more grounded, wore no crest on his breast, only a small pin shaped like an open book. "Ready?" he asked. "Always," she replied. The crowd below them, students, former servants, children of immigrants, roared in applause as the ribbon fell away. Forgiveness, Catherine had learned, wasn't given. It was built, like stone on stone, like name after name added to the wall of scholarship recipients now hanging in the Foundation's hall. And William Winchester, once her betrayer, was no longer just a man with a title. He was her ally, her equal, her proof that even the past could be rewritten, not erased, but redeemed. Spring in New York came quietly that year, not with fanfare or parades, but with subtle transformations. Ivy creeping back over old brick walls, sun filtering gently through clouds that had hung low for far too long, and voices, new voices, being heard in rooms where they had once been silenced. Catherine Morgan sat at her writing desk beneath the tall window of her home office. Her eyes scanned the morning letters, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Outside, the city was changing, and she had helped build that change. She looked down at the embossed card resting beneath her palm. Council for Economic Equity, Inaugural Session, May 3rd, 1899. Chairwoman, Madam Catherine Morgan, Co-Chair, William Elias Winchester. She closed her eyes. The past, the betrayal, the trial by fire. All of it had led here, and yet it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a rival. Months earlier, she had watched William work tirelessly, not for her approval, but from a growing truth within himself. He no longer stood on balconies above workers. He stood beside them, in meetings, in factories, in the slums he once pretended not to see. She had watched in silence, in caution, until the moment he no longer asked her to forgive, but simply continued doing what was right. And that was when she knew. Forgiveness, she had learned, wasn't a gift bestowed in response to a plea. It was a decision, a shared understanding. And so, one late afternoon beneath a quiet elm tree in Central Park, she turned to him and said softly, "You've changed the world, William. Now let's see what we can do together." Their wedding was private. No cathedral, no golden invitations, no royal pageantry, just a small garden in Brooklyn, a handful of close friends, and vows spoken not in spectacle, but in sincerity. "I do not take your name," she had told him gently, her hands in his. "I keep mine, not out of rebellion, but remembrance. I am Catherine Morgan. I built something from ruin, and that name carries every stone of it." William had smiled. "And I will stand beside that name," he said, "not to lead it, but to walk with it." The press didn't know what to do with them. A duke marrying a former maid, a woman refusing to take his title. They called her radical, revolutionary, dangerous. She wore each headline like a crown. Because the truth was more dangerous than scandal, it was unstoppable. Their first joint act was the creation of the People's Health House, a network of free clinics run by educated former domestic workers trained in care, hygiene and nutrition, followed by the Morgan schools, offering free evening education for laborers and immigrants. And when industrialists pushed back, claiming the programs were destabilizing the economy, Catherine invited them to debate her publicly, on stage, under lights, with workers present. She never lost a single round. Because she didn't argue from theory, she argued from lived truth. But it was the council that became her legacy. The idea was radical. A governing body made not only of business leaders, but of seamstresses, clerks, cobblers, janitors, equal in voice and vote. William had helped open the doors, but Catherine built the foundation. They met in the city's old guild hall, once a place of exclusion, now reimagined as the House of Common Futures. On the day of the council's opening, Catherine stood at the head of the great table. On one side sat factory owners, on the other, former workers. Between them, no guards, no hierarchy, just chairs, just voices. She looked to her left. There was William, no longer Duke Winchester, just William, advocate, partner, man. They exchanged a nod. Then she turned to the gathered assembly. "This table," she began, "is not about power, it is about presence." Her voice echoed through the high ceiling. For too long, decisions were made in silence, about people, without people. That ends today. She paused, letting the moment breathe. "The true test of nobility," she said, "is not in heritage. It is in courage, the courage to correct what was once convenient to ignore." The room fell into a hush so complete it could have cradled time itself. Then a single pair of hands clapped, then another and another, until the hall roared, not for her name, but for what it represented. That night, long after the applause had faded and the speeches ended, Catherine returned home. She stood at the window of their modest brownstone, far from the marble walls of aristocracy. William joined her, placing a hand gently at the small of her back. "Do you miss it?" he asked softly. "The titles? The estates?" She shook her head. "I never lived in a palace," she replied. "Only walked through one on my way to exile." He smiled. "And now?" She looked out at the lights of New York, no longer unreachable stars, but lamps that she had helped ignite. "Now I live in a city I helped rebuild." As they prepared for sleep, William paused at the doorway. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what would have happened if I had believed you that night? If I had stopped them?" Catherine thought for a moment. "I wouldn't be who I am," she said. "You wouldn't either." She turned to him. "We didn't meet our destiny. We made it out of ashes, out of anger, out of truth." He reached for her hand, and in the quiet of that night there were no titles, only two souls, equal. The final scene fades not with a wedding or a speech, but with a moment. Catherine Morgan, seated at the long council table, surrounded by voices that once had none. A shoemaker speaks, a landlord listens, a young woman in uniform proposes a new code of rights, and Catherine, Madame Morgan, smiles. Not because her story is over, but because the world has finally begun to listen. Injustice, a small word, yet powerful enough to redefine the fate of an entire life. This is the story of a young woman who was betrayed, humiliated, silenced. But she didn't disappear. She rose from the ashes. She didn't just reclaim her dignity, she rebuilt the world around her. Get ready to dive into a journey of pain, courage, and transformation. Because sometimes titles fall, masks shatter, and true power reveals itself in those who dare to defy fate. If this story has already stirred something inside you, subscribe to the channel. Because here, every narrative is crafted to touch the heart and spark deep reflection. Leave a like so more people can discover stories like Catherine's. Share this video with someone who believes in the strength of justice and resilience. Save this content if you ever want to relive each chapter of this journey when you need inspiration. And of course, don't forget to explore the other powerful stories on our channel. You never know which one might change the way you see the world.